Revelation chapter 12, beginning at verse 1, and we're going to go down through verse 17. Before we read that, I'll say that before I entered seminary, shortly after I graduated from university, one of the things I did was teach in a primary school for a couple of years. I taught fourth grade. And ever since that time, I've been joking with my family that I have a fourth grade answer for everything. And by that I mean that I can attempt to answer any question. But you should not expect necessarily that my answer will be any more satisfactory than it would be if you were a fourth grader. During the 2 years that I taught fourth grade, I think I heard every question that a person can ask. Remarkable things. I fielded unimaginable kinds of questions. They would be things like, why is the sky blue? It's the standard ones. Why do people from different nations have skin colored differently if they're all from Adam? Why would God create stars that nobody will ever see? Why do they call this crayon color burnt umber? Why do you call a bunch of geese a gaggle? Well, who ever came up with that one? Why do boys enjoy hitting each other so much? Can an angel die? Why do they call them apartments if they're all stuck together? Things like that. The natural inquisitiveness of young people is astounding, and it actually makes teaching fourth grade quite fun, to a point. You'll notice that I'm not still doing that. But I'm convinced that human beings never really get past that issue of being inquisitive about big questions. What changes when we become adults is we're embarrassed to ask them, it seems. We don't want people to know that we don't know why the sky is blue, that kind of thing. The questions are still there, they just don't get voiced out loud as much. And so our questions also change over time as time goes on. Instead of asking about trivial things that have little impact on us, we begin to ask bigger questions, at least inwardly, bigger, more personal questions. Things like, how am I going to be able to afford to help my kids go off to university if we can't even pay for the medical bills that we're dealing with? Why does Mr. So-and-so treat Mrs. So-and-so so poorly when she treats him so well? Why would the Lord choose to take this woman who's a mother by breast cancer when she leaves a husband and 5 children under the age of 14? Why do so many people in our country have such a low view of the value of human life? Perhaps the biggest question, one that Christians ask, is if Jesus Christ is sitting on the throne of heaven, he has all power and all authority, why does he allow such suffering and persecution to plague his own children? Sometimes I have to admit that even my best answer to those questions wouldn't even satisfy a fourth grader. I'm sure that when John was living, the man who wrote Revelation, at the close of the first century, that they were asking big questions in church as well. Questions like this: why is the church, which seeks to demonstrate love and teaches kindness in the name of Jesus, why is it so hated? Why is it the target of so much persecution, particularly by the Roman government? Why would God allow our pastor, our shepherd, together with several of the prominent men and women in our church, to be murdered and martyred? Why is it so hard for people who have witnessed or at least heard testimony of the resurrection of Jesus Christ to believe that he's the long-awaited Messiah? Why do they persist in their unbelief when the evidence is so inescapable? Why doesn't the church grow more quickly? And so on. We have a lot of those questions, similar questions today. Well, the purpose of the book of Revelation that we've been studying is in part to give some insight into these questions, to give us a perspective, at least, in how we approach the questions, to set the backdrop of a drama, to help the saints to know that God has real, satisfying answers. And the book isn't meant to complicate, as we've said. It's not meant to cloud things. It's not meant to complicate them, even though it has some strange symbols and illusions and illustrations, imagery. Its purpose is to reveal. Chapter 12 that we're in today continues this work of answering the big questions and important questions about life in the world. So let's look at chapter 12, the first 17 verses. Well, I guess it's the whole chapter. Chapter 12, the 17 verses. And we talk about two more very vivid images, a woman and a dragon today. It says this, "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared for God, by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated. And there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accused them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them, but woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth on the woman to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. And then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. We'll end the reading at the end of chapter 12 there. Chapter begins by introducing us to signs. Verse 1 says, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman. And then in verse 3, another sign appears in heaven. We have a great red dragon. Now, as you know, previously we've been going through a number of things that he's showing us. We have things that have appeared to us, 7 things typically. Previously we've been introduced to seals, and then we've gone through a series of 7 trumpets as well. And these have been a retelling of the cycles of God's judgments throughout the period of history between Christ's first coming and his second coming, up until that final judgment when he comes in his second return. But in chapter 12, we're introduced to a third cycle, a new cycle, which has a number of revealed elements which will explain that time period. So really, we're going back to look again at the same period of time between Christ's first and his second coming. And these aren't seals this time. They're not trumpets. They aren't even the bowls that are coming. But they're the telling of histories of certain characters that are in that period of time in that story. Chapter 12 will deal with only 2 of these, 2 histories, the history of the woman and the history of this dragon. Now, signs are things that point to something else. So we're not talking about a literal woman, and we're not talking about a literal dragon, right? Chapter 12 through 14, these chapters that we're now entering, you're going to see not only the history of the woman and the dragon, but we're going to be introduced to other terms that are similar. We'll be introduced to the one called the beast, one called the false prophet. We're going to get the history of the 144,000, the history of the angelic heralds, and finally we're going to be introduced to the Son of Man and his history. And this will set the stage for the retelling of that time period yet one more time as we get into the 7 bowls. So it's a lot, but I hope you can stay with me. But we begin in chapter 12 with the woman and the dragon. 2 combatants in a great battle in history. And again, notice that this period of time is described as a battle. So 2 combatants. We begin with the woman. But we can't just leave the woman by herself because she's with child. We have to include the child as well. And this woman is described in such a way that we know who she is. We don't have to wrestle with who she represents as one of the signs. And this is where we go back to the passage that we read in Genesis 37. Okay? She is described here as clothed with the sun, the moon is under her feet, and she's wearing a crown of 12 stars. Sun, moon, and 12 stars. Now, I hope you've been trained well enough now that when we're looking for meaning in symbols, we go back to the Old Testament to look for them. And is there such a thing where we have sun, moon, and stars? 12 stars. Actually, we did. We read it in chapter 37, verse 9. Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, has this dream, and he tells it to his family, and he says, "Behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." Wait a minute, that's only 11 stars. But that's because Joseph's telling the story. He's one of the stars as well. He's the 12th star, if you will. So you've got 12 there, sun, moon, and stars. We're talking about the family, then, of Jacob. The sun and moon in that dream clearly referred to his parents. So Revelation 12 is borrowing language from Genesis to talk about this idea of who the woman is. Who are we talking about? We're talking about this family of Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So we're talking about the family of Israel. Okay? These are the favored, chosen people of God. And as we go on in the chapter, we're going to realize that this people of God are not just that Old Testament nation of Israel, not just those covenant people, but in fact, they will broaden also to include all the ones who are then sons of Abraham by faith. That we're talking about the people of God completely. The Old and New Testaments, the church. These are the ones who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. It's talked about later. So this is the first combatant we're talking about. We're talking tonight about the church. And the church is being faced by this other one who is a sign of something who's called the dragon. And the second one's more obvious because it actually tells us who he is. He is the one described here as the great dragon, thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. So, though we're faced by some new symbols, some new terminology, some imagery, really, we know who we're talking about here. Satan's described there as a terrible and powerful beast with 7 heads. We're familiar by now with the number 7. If I asked you what does the 7 heads represent on Satan, 7 is this idea of completeness and fullness. So you're dealing with an enemy who has it all. He's the complete package of an enemy. And he's red. Red was the color of the red horse that we want to talk about. And of course that's a symbol of war. He has 10 horns. I could go to you and ask, what's the 10 horns about? Well, horns in the scripture always represent the strength and power of some. It's a metaphor for strength. And so 10 of them, he's got a lot of power. He's very powerful, and each head wears a crown. Oh, how Satan likes to imitate Christ. How he likes to masquerade in God's power as if he had it all. The crowns represent a measure of authority, right? And so Satan, the deceiver of the world, tries to act as if he were the one in authority, the one with the power. He wars against all that's good, all that's God's, and we should note 2 things here. We should note, first of all, that Satan does have a measure of authority. He really does have some power. He has some measure of influence. Again, we talked about how John 12 calls him the ruler of the world. So he has some authority over it. He's a terrible foe. 7 heads. He's hard to deal with. He's a daunting foe. He's the one more powerful than God's people are, by themselves, in their own strength. Were the pregnant woman to try to defend herself in her own strength, a pregnant woman here would lose that battle. That's kind of the point that we're talking about. But then secondly, we realize not only does Satan have a measure of power and authority, but notice that she's not alone. She's not fighting this battle by herself. She's not called to fight the dragon in her own strength. She is protected by God himself. He has a place that's prepared for her, you'll notice. Verse 6, a place of nourishment and protection where she's taken. More on that in a minute. But verse 5 tells us why the dragon's, what his real priority is, what he's really about. It's not even so much the woman, because what he's after is the child. This one who is the child she carries. He is set at first, at least, on devouring that child once he's born. Why? Because he's the one, it says, who is to rule all the nations. We're introduced to this idea that the cosmic battle that's taking place between the powers of evil and the powers of good, God and his people and Satan himself, is a battle over who will rule, who will have authority and rule. So John is he's being introduced to two historic characters who are at war. And the subsequent verses speak further about the nature of that battle. Before we talk about the battle, I have to mention that the woman's battle is against an enemy who is just absolutely a perverted enemy. I mean, consider how it's described to you. He's attacking a pregnant woman. Someone who's in that position, who's in labor at the moment. So she's not in a condition to fight. And that's who he's after. And he wants to kill the child. All of this, again, highlighting the terrific enemy that the church is up against. Don't mistake it. When you find opposition against the efforts you have to see the church thrive in Frankston or anywhere else, it's because you have a devouring enemy who will do everything in his power to fight it. So, all this again highlights the enemy's power and the church is up against. And yet, the church is dependent upon God for deliverance and for victory. If you highlight the message tonight, what's the point of this message? That's it. That we as a church are dependent upon our God for victory. Now, if this woman symbolizes the covenant people of God, in what sense can you say that she gives birth to this child? And we know who the child is. We're talking about Christ. So in what sense did the church give birth to Christ? That's a strange imagery. He's the one who is to rule over the nations with a rod of iron. Where do we get that terminology from, the ruling with a rod of iron? That comes from Psalm 2 that we sang. Psalm 2 says this, "Ask of me and I will make you the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession." That'll be what you will rule over, the nations. "And you will break them with a rod of iron, and you'll dash them like pieces, like a potter's vessel." So, we understand the woman is giving birth in the sense, we're wrestling, how did that happen? Well, in the sense that Christ comes from the family of Israel. He is one of Israel, from the specific tribe of Judah. He comes into the world, as it were, as a child of Israel. He's one of their own. In fact, he made a very vivid point of that when he was baptized. Why was Jesus baptized? If we think of the imagery of baptism as cleansing from sin, actually I often suggest to you that the primary significance of that was identification with the covenant people of God. And that's what Jesus was doing in that picture, was to identify with the family. And so throughout the history of God's people, this enemy, Satan, the dragon, has been trying to stop the birth of this Messiah who is promised. Just, if you ever want to do something interesting, make a list of all the times that Satan tried to stop Jesus' birth. You can go pretty far back. I'll just give you two examples that maybe will be helpful, where he's trying to devour the birth of the child. One of those is in 2 Chronicles chapter 22. It's when Athaliah, who was the mother of a king who died, Ahaziah was the king, he died, and she there wasn't somebody to immediately step into authority, so she did. And she says, in order to maintain that authority, I'll kill off all the opposition. And she begins a process of murdering all of the royal family. She's murdering the house of Judah, particularly. Now think of that, because the line of David is through the tribe of Judah. If she kills off all of Judah, then that promise cannot happen. It won't be fulfilled. Had she been successful on that occasion, the line of Judah would have come to an end and the prophecy of the Messiah would not have been able to be fulfilled. And yet God does something in that story. It's very vivid. he snatches the child away and hides him. Somebody comes and does that the line might be preserved and the Messiah might come to rule. The other example I mentioned is pretty obvious, and that's the time of Jesus' actual birth. You have a sense that Satan stood by another woman, as it were, and tried to put a death to the child once he was born. And I'm talking about Herod, King Herod, at the time that Mary gave birth to him. Why? What's the issue there? Herod doesn't want somebody else to rule. It's an issue of who will rule. And so he tries to put to death this baby. And what happens again? Once again, the Lord snatches Jesus away. He's taken down to Egypt and he's hidden away. And the dragon's attempts are thwarted that he might live and that he might reign. So that's that first point. What then do we learn about the nature of this epic battle? What are some of the things we get? We've got the two combatants. Here's the nature of the battle. Really two truths I want to point out tonight being conveyed to John, to his readers, to us. And these are things I think that help us as we live day by day. The first one is this, and that is that Satan, the dragon, is a defeated enemy. Whereas this foe is a mighty foe, and I think we'd be foolish to think that we could overcome him on our own strength. Still, his power and his authority is limited. Notice in verse 4 that though the damage he does is impressive damage, what does he do in that? His tail sweeps away the stars of heaven, and a third of them are cast down to the earth. That's pretty impressive. But it's not comprehensive. It's limited. It has a limit. Verses 1 to 8 describe the battle from an earthly perspective, of course. And we think of the coming of Christ and Satan's attempts to stop it, to annihilate the kingdom of God as taking place on the earth with Jesus' birth. But verses 7 to 17 give us a bigger picture of that, right? Describing that this war is actually much bigger than just an earthly perspective. It's a universal battle which simultaneously is taking place not only on the earth but also in heaven. It's a cosmic battle. Verse 8 makes it clear to us as believers that this is a defeated enemy that we're dealing with. It may not seem like it, but verse 10 indicates he is a vanquished one who has been thrown down. Sometimes the way things are written in Revelation, and not just in Revelation, other portions of the New Testament, it's subtle, but it's very poignant. Notice how abbreviated the version of the story of this child is. This is how it's abbreviated in the passage in verse 5. He was born and he was caught up to God and to his throne. That's it. That's the story. Christ is caught up to the throne. He's ruling. Verse 10 goes on, I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. The accuser of our brothers has been thrown down. Now, some maybe are thinking that throwing down is referring to that time when he was first cast out of heaven, maybe around the time of the fall in the Garden of Eden when Satan rebelled. But that's not, I don't think, what's being referred to here. What's being referred to here is that fall that Satan endures, that's taking place when Christ completed his atoning work, when he came to the earth. And he lived obediently and then went to the cross. And he was put to death but raised again. Satan wages war on your heart, I suggest, every day. By one of the things he says he does is to accuse you of your sin before God. And yet, what does Christ do on the cross that deals with that? His work is finished on the cross. Our greatest foe is defeated by the fact that now there is no charge that can stick. This one is covered in the righteousness of Christ. The throwing down could be likened to what children used to do in my playground, which was play a game called King of the Hill. Did you ever play that? It's brutal. Well, what you have is this little mound of some kind, and the idea is that whoever can be on the top of the hill is the one who rules. But you see, Satan has been cast down. He is off the top of the hill. He's not the one in charge. He's been subdued. He's been defeated. When Christ rose from the dead, he told his disciples that all authority in heaven and on earth had been given to him. Now, we said last week he already had authority, that his dominion was an everlasting dominion from the beginning. And yet now, in the working out of it in his time on the earth, it is accomplished. His kingdom is established. In fulfillment of Psalm 2 that we said, Jesus then begins ruling with a rod of iron, and he begins to conquer his foes. Prior to his death and resurrection, Jesus sent out his disciples. You'll remember one of the things he does. And what starts to happen when the kingdom is coming? When Jesus starts to illustrate his reign, he sends out his disciples, and they start to cast out demons in his name. They begin to heal. A reversal of the fall starts to happen in the reign of the king. And then, of course, after the resurrection, the final casting out of the chief enemy is completed. He is finally beaten. And yet, until the return of Christ, the second coming, the second lesson we are to learn is that he's still annoying. Satan still annoys us. He's a defeated enemy, but he's a bad loser, if I could say it that way. You watch any sporting events where you've seen bad losers? Sometimes referees will have to deal with bad losers. Maybe are on a basketball court or something like that, and they get defeated, and so somebody takes the basketball and just punts it up into the stands. And the referee has to give a charge to that person, say, you're not going to play the next game because you did that, or something of that nature. Maybe they have a late hit on a player after the game is kind of over, or something of that nature. Maybe you see immature individuals who are playing a board game, and when it doesn't go their way, they just get furious and kind of throw the board. I consider that a little bit what Satan is doing today. He knows he's lost. And his time is short, it says in the passage, and like the sad loser, he wishes to do as much damage as he can before he's locked away for good. He's the father of all lies, and maybe we even think that because he's that, he's like a lot of liars. Maybe he believes his own lie. Maybe he believes that there's still a possibility for him to rule. We're not sure. But he's the father of these lies, thinking that he's not defeated. There's still hope of gaining power and authority, so he continues to harm, to destroy, to twist, to lame and maim, and so on. But since Satan's plot to destroy Jesus failed, he didn't put an end to this birth of the child, wasn't able to stop the coming of the Messiah, it seems like he then turns his attention to the mother in the story. If he can't devour the child, he'll do his best to devour the mother. We read in 1 Peter 5:8, your adversary, the devil, continues to prowl around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So we need a little perspective here about what is that mother, the church, the people of God today. How are we to deal with this? Heaven's perspective on the battle is given. If you're in Christ and you're seeking to serve him in your daily life, then you are, in fact, one of these who are engaged in a battle. It's a spiritual battle. It really is an epic battle. What a tragedy when someone is a believer and yet they don't realize they're in battle. Can you imagine what it would be like to be a soldier who didn't realize he was actually in a battle? He's walking through life over the battlefield, not realizing that he has an enemy who's trying to put him to death. We would think there's something that's got to change there. That individual needs to understand, because the enemy has put out landmines everywhere, trying to devour, to destroy the servant there, the one who's the soldier. Like a person maybe in a stupor of some kind, walking aimlessly between trenches on the front lines of a battlefield. We're bound to be in harm's way if you're going to deal with things that way. And Satan has put out those mines, and unless we know we're in a battle, we're bound to be injured. Now, our enemy's defeated, according to the Scriptures. That's our greatest comfort. That's our hope, enabling us to face all kinds of difficulties in life. But the church is still what we call, in that time period, we call ourselves the church militant. We're at war until our defeated foe is finally put away. In the meantime, Christians must not attempt to fight the war in the same way that we would try to win a physical war, or even a political or a philosophical war. We don't have the strength to do that. Our battle in the world is not against mere flesh and blood. Our battle is against angels and principalities and powers that are superhuman. They are otherworldly, and they are far more strong than we are. Ephesians 6:12, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil that are in the heavenly places. That's a bit daunting. And if that weren't bad enough, we're likened to a woman in labor as we go about our fight. We're not in a condition to fight this in our own strength. But we have a victorious king who rules over all things, and he gives grace and strength to overcome the enemy. One of the songs I really like to sing in the scriptures is Psalm 68. Awesome is God from his sanctuary, the God of Israel. He is the one who gives power and strength to his people. Blessed be God, it says. And we have to say that too, that we're really reliant upon that. Now, we said that it's not only going on in heaven, but it's also going on the earth. Listen to what Paul says in Ephesians 3:8 through 10. To me, though I am the very least of all saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to bring to light for everyone what is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages in God who created all things, so that through the church, that's the woman in our story, the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and the authorities in the heavenly places. So heaven's perspective could be summarized this way. The church continues to fight a defeated foe, and yet who is still nasty, he's still vindictive. They fight in God's strength, nourished and protected by him. And we live in what Dennis Johnson calls an era of persecution and protection. We live in an era of persecution and protection. Notice that the woman is cared for here, that there's a place prepared for her. Verse 6, and the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Those 1,260 days is the time period we're talking about. This is the reference to that period between Christ's first and second coming. So while we're living right now, we have a place of protection. This is similar again to the journey of God's people through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. You remember that at one point, after they had become established, Elijah, like Elijah, God takes his saints out into the wilderness to protect them and nourish them. But notice it's a desert wilderness. They're protected, but they're in the wilderness. God doesn't make it a resort. It's not as though they're at the Whitsunday Islands or something of that nature, right? This life we're living, this period that we're in is rough. It's hard sometimes. Dry, parched land. The psalmist speaks of, I am in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water. He needs God's attention, God's care. So Christianity and serving Christ in this age, we have to really be careful we don't tout that as if it were easy. As you come to Christ and your life is just going to be easy. Nonsense. You're in battle. Easier than maybe what it would be without Christ, for sure. So we serve a kind of gracious master rather than one who is out to destroy us, but it's not all fun and games. But then finally we have to remember that it's not only Christ who is victorious over Satan and his attempts to destroy. The saints, too, are called victorious in Christ. The church is victorious against this warring, devouring dragon. Why? Because of the gospel. Verse 14, the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent. The gospel is our greatest weapon against the accuser. It's a God-given weapon. It's our most treasured gift. In battle, it's our sharpest weapon, because it also serves with healing salve to the one who uses it. Notice verse 11, they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. This is what we as a church hope to be about. We know we have a great enemy. We're not surprised when things don't go well in the battle. But we remember that we are protected. We have a caregiver who is all-powerful and who has already won the battle. So take heart. dear saints, and continue to labor in his name. And this really does lead us into the Lord's Supper, because the Lord gives us this institution of this sacrament to remind us of something very important as we go into the battle. So let's pray.